Basic Brewing Radio is sponsored in part by the American Homebrewers Association. On Saturday, May 7th, 2022, the American Homebrewers Association invites you to celebrate Big Brew for National Homebrew Day. Big Brew is an opportunity to fire up the kettle and raise a glass to the greatest hobby there is, homebrewing. Get a promo code for $5 off an annual American Homebrewers Association membership when you make the Big Brew pledge. Visit homebrewersassociation.org/basicbrewing for offer details, the official 2022 Big Brew recipes, homebrewing tutorials, and more. That's homebrewersassociation.org/basicbrewing to get $5 off when you make the Big Brew pledge. Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, May 5th, 2022. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, our good friend Casey Letellier of Ivory Brewing lets me sit in on a brew day as he brews with Kernza, a newly emerging perennial grain. I also get to pick Casey's brain about how he develops recipes for his brewery in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. If you go to basicbrewing.com, you can find archives of our audio and video shows, and if you go to basicbrewingshop.com, you can find our DVDs and our brewer's logbooks. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Basic Brewing and find our show page on Facebook as well. If you want to support us financially, check out patreon.com/basicbrewing, and many thanks to everybody who's helping out in that way. If you go to patreon.com/basicbrewing, you can see a long list of stuff that you can access if you sign up as a supporter. It may be a week or two until Steve Wilkes and I can get together to shoot anything for the video side of things. Steve started moving into a rental house as he and his wife Gretchen begin the process of building a new home. Very excited for them. And coincidentally, I've developed a bad back that I'm sure will clear up just about the time they get all settled into the rent house. Just kidding. I've offered to help Steve if and when he needs it. And I'm surprised that my back isn't sore for sure after shoveling out Casey's mash tun at Ivory. He posted a picture of me with a shovel full of, partially full of wet grain there. And as you'll hear in the interview, Casey broke his foot and was hobbling around the brewery in a boot. So I was happy to shovel out the mash tun, and I'm thankful that Casey doesn't have a bigger system. It was a great day. Spending time with Casey. I shot a lot of video, and my plan is to use it in a future Basic Brewing video episode once the Kernza beer is on tap and ready to sample. Following my conversation with Matt Giovanisi about simplifying water chemistry, I took the plunge and ordered a test kit from Ward Labs, and I got the empty bottle in the mail or FedEx and filled it full of water, filtered water from my tap, and sent it back in, and I got the results, and I plugged them into the Brewfather thingy. And for those taking notes, in parts per million, my calcium is 26, magnesium 2, sodium 10, chloride 3, sulfate 5, and bicarbonate 55. What that means, I don't know, but I can use that as a profile in the application as my source water, just like Matt talked about. And the app will figure out how much stuff that I need to add to hit the target profiles that I select. And it seems easy enough. I've played with it a bit. I got an email from listener Kenneth in Kentucky who said he enjoyed the conversation with Matt, as did I. And Kenneth says, I highly recommend Brewing Water Spreadsheet from Martin Brungard. He's very knowledgeable about water and is a good brewer. I met him in Indiana at the Foam Blowers of Indiana, or FBI, Homebrew Club. Shout out to them. I use Beersmith brewing software for my recipes, and it has a nice water program too. Kenneth says you can download the Brewing Water Excel spreadsheet for free at brewingwater.com. That's BRUN water.com. And you can enter water data and brew information to calculate mash pH and mineral content. And Kenneth continues, I've compared the pH mash predictions with water chemicals from Brewing Water and Beersmith, and they are both close to the measured mash pH. I no longer take mash pH measurements because I found these calculators get my beers within the preferred mash pH of 5.2 to 5.6. Kenneth says, I mostly use phosphoric acid over lactic acid because some people get a tangy off flavor when more than 1 milliliter of lactic acid per gallon is added to the mash water. And he concludes, when brewing light-colored beers like lagers and cream ales, I dilute my tap water with about 50% distilled water. And for amber and darker ales, I use 100% tap water. Well, there you go. It's a strategy that you can use to sort of straddle the line there. If your water's not perfect for the lighter beers, say, you can dilute it with some distilled water. I appreciate that, Kenneth. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this Saturday is Big Brew, and I'm going to drop in at High Gravity in Tulsa sort of mid to late afternoon. At least that's the plan. And we're heading to Tulsa to see Elvis Costello at Kane's Ballroom. And I said last week that Nick Lowe was opening, but I found out that Elvis will, in fact, not have an opening act. That's what Kane's Ballroom says. Lowe will be joining Costello apparently later in the tour, and I was confused. But oh well, it'll be an amazing show anyway. An evening made even more amazing because we'll be with our friends and sponsors Desiree and Dave from HighGravityBrew.com. From now until Mother's Day, which is Sunday, all gift certificates on HighGravityBrew.com are 10% off. And I know what you're thinking. Isn't that kind of like giving her a bowling ball with your name on it? Well, not necessarily. I know there are a lot of moms out there, including Desiree, who love to brew and would be very happy with this gift certificate from HighGravityBrew.com. Even if she doesn't brew, you can use your discounted gift certificate to buy ingredients to brew her favorite beer. From now until Mother's Day, you can get a $40 gift certificate for $36, a $75 gift certificate for $67.50, or a $100 gift certificate for $90. You get the idea. And there's more than beer at HighGravityBrew.com, like wine kits, cheese-making kits, and a kombucha starter kit. And, of course, all the excellent Warthog electric brewing gear that can take the pain out of propane. Check it all out at family-owned and operated HighGravityBrew.com. That's HighGravityBrew.com. Okay, let's talk to our good friend for many years, since the beginning, Casey Letellier, about brewing with Kernza. Casey Letellier, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back.
I think the last time that we brewed together was in 2005 at your house in Siloam Springs, wasn't it? I mean, I don't think we've actually... I mean, you're doing all the work. I'm watching you brew, but I think that's the last time that we've been together where beer has been brewed, right?
We brewed together on your deck.
Oh, that's right. Darn it.
2008? 2009. Yeah, you and me and Steve brewed on your deck. Yeah.
Okay, you got a better memory than I do. People bring up episodes of the podcast, and I'm like, I think we've talked to somebody about that, and it turns out, it's 15 years ago, but so good for you. Your mind is sharper than mine.
You've got quite a library of episodes at this point, so yeah.
I guess I can be forgiven. We are here. I asked to shoot some video of you brewing because I've got this newfangled camera that I'm still getting used to, and so I wanted to actually be in an environment where I was actually shooting some things, not in like a documentarian kind of a thing. And I also wanted an environment where if I completely screwed up, it would be okay. So, so no paying client, no high stakes or anything like that. And so far it's working out well. But you suggested that we brew or we get together and document this beer because there is a special ingredient going into it. What are we brewing with today?
So today we're brewing with Kernza, which is perennial grain, and in fact, the first perennial grain. It was developed at the Land Institute in Kansas. Over the last 40 years, they've just been very slowly, painstakingly selecting for basically a grass that they could select for a usable, nutritious seed head. the implications of this are just really amazing. Most annual grain, which is what we all brew with, has roots that are about a foot deep. That makes those plants incredibly susceptible to drought. Also, growing annual grains means pass after pass after pass through the field with your tractor. There's going to be cultivation, planting. There'll be passes for fertilizer, herbicide, pesticide, going through the field again in the fall for harvest, and then subsequent plowing that under. And every time there's that pass through the field, you're disturbing the soil, and the soil is blowing away. So, by contrast, a perennial grain, especially when it's used sort of in rotation with livestock, which is going to be a thing with Kernza, you might need to make one pass a year. If you're rotating cattle through the field, the cattle are actually providing the fertilizer, and then they sort of eat down the roughage. You rotate the cattle out when the Kernza is ready to grow. It chokes out weeds. It doesn't require additional pesticide or herbicide. They're also doing some experiments with, instead of having livestock in the field, they're planting rows of something that can do nitrogen fixing, peas, alfalfa, and then rows of Kernza in between it. But yeah, perennial grain, it's incredibly exciting. Yield at this point is still relatively low. So it's incredibly expensive. But they're continuing to improve the grain. This is the kind of crazy thing, is that we think about, like, you're comparing this Kernza grain that's we're on, I think, the third harvest season where it's been like a viable crop. So it's still new. And you compare that to all the other grains we used, and humans have been sort of selecting for better and better and more productive sort of versions of those for millennia. So there's still work to do, but it's amazing to see this as a viable product. And it probably won't totally displace all the other sort of annual kind of crops we use, but especially in places where the soil is especially erodible, this could be just a revolution in agriculture.
Yeah, you were talking about that. It's only been around for, what'd you say, 40 years?
They've been working to develop it for 40 years, but it's actually only been to the point where they've released it to people outside of the sort of development community who've been growing it. So now it's actually like in farm fields in Kansas and Minnesota, and I can buy it. I can actually buy a bag of grain.
Yeah, and what you were saying is right, that the grains that we have, like corn, is grass, and wheat, I guess, is a grass, or but these have been domesticated over generations and generations and generations and generations. So to come up with a marketable product in only 40 years is a pretty incredible accomplishment.
It really is, especially when they were committed to kind of doing the old-fashioned version of just like field selection. So it's not genetically modified. It's which feels like a hopeful development for the sort of future of this, in that it has like very stable genetics, as opposed to kind of an engineered product. It's really exciting. Failed to mention in my earlier monologue that one of the other sort of benefits of a perennial is the extensive root structure. So Kernza has roots that go down anywhere from 10 to 15 feet after it's established, which means it's incredibly drought tolerant. It holds down soil, and whereas most conventional farming practices release carbon into the atmosphere, Kernza is actually carbon fixing. So a field that grew Kernza for 100 years would actually be holding substantially more carbon than a field with annuals.
Plus, you're not using as much pesticide, one would think, and other materials, fossil fuels, and things like that to run the tractors, to make the chemicals that go on it, and all these things. And just to clarify for those who might not be plant-oriented, a perennial comes up year after year after year, and you don't have to replant it. An annual, you have to replant it every year, and that's a huge difference.
Yes. Yep. Exactly.
So describe if we were holding some in our hands, what would it look like?
It's very small, which comes up in the complication of using it. It is too small to use the sort of traditional roller mill for. So the mill that I would use to crush barley, wheat, rye, it will run through that and come out on the other side completely unchanged. So they're quite small grains. It requires some adaptation for being able to crush them. And the version we are using today is just raw grain. They are working on a malted version, which should be a little bit more friable. That will help. And they're also working on doing flaked Kernza, which would be much easier as well. And I'm excited to give that a try for any of the kind of places where I might use flaked oats, just kind of building some body in a beer, and that would be a substantially less headache. I've had to do a very hokey attaching a food processor motor to essentially a cornmeal mill and then hand feeding the Kernza through that. So it's not ideal.
It's a Corona mill. People might be familiar with the Corona mills, which people used to use in the early days of homebrewing, but they're notoriously hard to adjust the gap correctly. And I looked at you have a 50-pound bag of the Kernza that you milled, and there's a lot of flour in there, but it's only a minority of the grain bill.
Yes. So it's about 20% of this batch of beer. So having an imperfect crush works in this case. But if you were using a higher percentage in the mash, you would want a better crush than I was able to achieve. So.
Yeah, we've had experiments on the show where people have just brewed beer with flour, and it works. I mean, the biggest challenge is not getting a stuck sparge, but you've got an insurance policy in there in that you're using some rice hulls as well.
Yes. Yep. Added a few rice hulls just to kind of make sure.
So you've got a product that is not malted. It's a raw grain. And so traditionally we're taught in brewing that if you're using a raw grain like cornmeal or something like that, that has not been gelatinized, you have to heat it. You have to cook it and do a cereal mash to make it available for the enzymes in the mash to break that apart into sugars. So you're not worried about that?
No. So that's another sort of way that the pretty fine crush feels like a good insurance policy for making this sort of more simplified process successful. We've done this with cornmeal with one of our sort of flagship beers, and as long as the cornmeal is a really fine grind, I get great conversion just adding it to the mash. If I have had issues when I've tried to use a coarser version of cornmeal where I don't get as good of conversion, where it feels like the outsides of the little kind of niblets of corn have been gelatinized and accessed, but there's still it's inefficient. So I have found that the process has been successful as long as the crush is on the small side.
Yeah, you can't argue with success, I guess. And we tasted the wort a few minutes ago, and it is super sweet. And you're mashing in at a lower water to grain ratio than what I'm used to. So my worts don't taste nearly as sweet as what so it surprised me. I was like, oh yeah. I remember how first runnings used to taste. But the aroma that we get off of that, I said spicy off of the mash tun. Is that the character that you've experienced in using this Kernza?
Yes. There's we both also sort of noted when we tasted it, there's like a pleasant grainy quality, like a little bit like Cheerios. I get some kind of apricot notes and then cinnamon and nutmeg. It has a really nice spice quality. And I've used the other malt we're using is an Italian Pilsner malt called Letellier. And I've used that malt on its own, and it does not show those same characteristics. So I feel confident what we're tasting is, in fact, Kernza characteristics.
There's good news for lager lovers from our friends and sponsors at Imperial Organic Yeast. Casey at Imperial says their winter seasonal yeast, L26 Pilgrimage, was so popular they're extending its availability through the end of May. I used Pilgrimage on 2 beers, my Passion Fruit Pilsner and my Toasted Rye Doppelbock. Both beers are just fond memories now, but Pilgrimage did a great job of fermenting those beers cleanly, letting the character of the beers shine through. Each had their challenges. The Pilsner had 3 pounds of passion fruit puree added after primary fermentation, and the Doppelbock was a pretty big beer, starting off at 1071, but Pilgrimage jumped right in and did great, even without a starter, at lager temperatures. And I'd like to say my stir plate is dusty because I don't use it anymore to make starters for moderate gravity 5-gallon batches because of Imperial's 200 billion cells per easy-to-open package. And for ales, my airlocks are usually bubbling before bedtime. With the cooler fermentation temperature for the lager, Pilgrimage was a little slower, but it was definitely bubbling by breakfast. Ask your local homebrew store about L26 Pilgrimage from Imperial Organic Yeast, and check them out at imperialyeast.com. That's imperialyeast.com. And talk about the beer that you built.
So this is going to be a strong, fairly pale, so a beer that is a little bit reminiscent of a Belgian triple, but in process is nothing like a Belgian triple. It will be all malt, and we have only the one yeast strain that we use. So we'll let this sort of ferment into a little bit higher of the sort of temperature range of our yeast, and we mashed really, really low, trying to make a very fermentable wort. It's a challenge using. So right now, Kernza is very expensive. So that 20% of our malt bill that's Kernza costs as much as the 80% of really top quality heirloom Letellier barley. So it's not even using sort of cheap base malt. So in that context, it made sense for us to make a strong beer, because the sort of pricing structure means that we can sort of charge $10 for a serving of this, and people sort of see how strong it is, and the sort of additional alcohol kind of adds perceived additional value. Whereas if we were to make a session strength beer, we would still need to charge $8 or $9 for a pint, and that's a harder sell.
And so why it's difficult? It's expensive. It's difficult to work with. Why, you have to charge more for it. Why mess with the stuff? If I can be the cynic, why do it?
So Wendell Berry said, eating is an agricultural act. And by extension, brewing is an agricultural act too. So every batch of beer we brew, that is acres of for like land that you can grow things on, committed to what we're willing to buy. So helping prove that there is a real market for Kernza, especially at this early stage where farmers are feeling like, the seed is expensive. It's something where you can't just sort of, there isn't an established commodity market for it. So, especially at this stage where all those sort of logistics are being established, it's really important for those of us who care about land use and want to see sort of sustainable agriculture for the future to figure out ways to kind of incorporate it into our process whenever we can, and talk about it, which I appreciate that we're having a chance to talk about this. Of all the beers I'm making right now, this is the one that I feel like I want people to know about Kernza. You can get it on a home brewing scale, and at this point, it is not like so many of the brewing practices where breweries have been doing these things for ages. There's already an established protocol. The home brewing community can be part of learning how to use this grain well, figuring out what styles it works best with. Right now, like the recipe that we're doing for this beer is like everything is really, really scaled back. The hopping is going to be very restrained, no dry hopping, trying to sort of show this grain off in the like simplest way I can, partly because we don't know yet like what sort of places where we could use it where Kernza would actually elevate a bunch of other ingredients. So we're trying to show it off as it is now, but like we need hundreds of experiments to be happening with people playing with this grain, seeing what it can do, seeing how high of a percentage it can be used in, trying out the sort of different versions of it. The malt version is just coming online. I haven't had a chance to use that yet. Flakes is coming online soon too. Kernza hulls are going to be available, which will be kind of a nice option versus rice hulls. So, yeah, I want to see this grain out there and people playing with it and proving that there's a market for this grain.
And in a way, homebrewers could be more capable of using it, using techniques like brew in a bag, where you don't have to worry about getting a stuck sparge. Using some of the techniques that might not be practical for, larger brewers to use. So talk about your hopping schedule. Talk about what hops you're going to use and when you're going to use them.
So we'll use a small addition of Northern Brewer for bittering, and then a very small addition of German Hersbrucker. Actually, I haven't quite decided if I'm going to do Hersbrucker or Tettnanger. Something noble, something elegant at the very end, but very restrained. I really want people to taste Kernza.
And we're in the process of collecting the wort now, and the longer questions that I ask are because Casey's running over to push a button or move a hose or something.
I'm back.
So, I could edit later, but it's lazy. And speaking of lazy, Honey, the sweet little puppy dog, is lying at your feet. At one of your you've broken one of your feet. This is the current. Should we talk about the Kernza curse?
Yeah. James, you and I have been trying to get together to brew this beer for 2 months, and in that time, it's been one thing after another that has delayed this brew day. So it's exciting that it's finally here. But I do think in that time, so I've broken my foot. My 14-year-old has broken his arm. It's just been like, it felt like one disaster after another, kind of pushing this brew day back. But here we are. We are finally here.
And everything's going, not good. Everything's going well. So I'm really looking forward to this beer. And anything else about Kernza that you want to talk about before we switch topics?
So we have a few folks from the Land Institute, the organization, the nonprofit organization in Kansas that developed this grain, and they are coming to the brewery to talk about Kernza for the beer release, which should be May 20th.
Oh.
So, depending on when this show airs, that might be too late.
No, I'm putting this out next week. So, yeah, mark your calendars. Come to Siloam Springs to Ivoryville and taste this beer and hear the talk. It's exciting.
From the people who are growing it. So, yeah.
You might be able to get some business cards and find out where to get some for yourself.
If you would like to get some for yourself, I did some research. If you're interested in the sort of like a couple of pound quantities where you could kind of do a recipe similar to what we're doing, Perennial Pantry online has Kernza available.
So what are other people using it for?
Bread, pasta. In a lot of the places where you might use wheat, people are trying sort of. There is some all Kernza pasta. At this point, I don't think anyone's doing 100% Kernza bread. But yeah, it's experimentation stage. So
the most recent issue of Bon Appetit has a lot of future foods. And did you see it? And they have a hamburger bun where they mentioned Kernza.
Yes.
So I was like, hey, I know what that is. And it was like it looked like a rye, if my memory serves me. It was like a darker, like a rye colored bun. So but Kernza is not gluten free, right?
No, it does not. It does not start gluten-free, which is a longer discussion. We've already had the discussion at some point about that all the beers we brew start with traditional brewing grains that do have gluten, but then because of an enzyme that I heard about from you, we use an enzyme during fermentation, breaks down the protein that causes a gluten reaction. And again, the fellow that you had on the show, actually, we sent samples off to his lab, and he tested our beers to confirm that they are essentially gluten-free. So thank you again. Thank you. That's been like a transformative thing because my wife Dorothy is celiac, so she can drink our beers, and a whole bunch of other people who can't drink most beers can drink our beer.
Yeah, and the same thing is happening over at High Gravity at Pippin's Tap Room because Desiree also is a celiac or has celiac disease, and they reduce the gluten to undetectable levels using the same enzyme over there. So, yay. Our friends and sponsors Ricky and Kelly from Groenfell and Havoc Meaderies in Vermont have another tea-based honey beverage in the pipeline that's sure to be refreshing for upcoming hot summer days. Ricky the mead maker says they're canning Buckland mead this week, and it's available for pre-sale right now on Groenfell.com. Buckland is made from fresh lemon, green rooibos tea, and 100% wildflower honey. Ricky says it just may be the world's most refreshing mead. Buckland is only 4.8 ABV, so it'd be perfect for sipping as you're grilling on the patio, great for relaxing on the porch after you mow the lawn, or perfect pairing for dangling your feet into the lake from the dock. Buckland is only one of a wide range of deliciously drinkable honey-based beverages that you can have sent to you across the country in most states from Groenfell.com. And you can get free shipping on orders to most states For orders more than $75, you get free shipping. Check out Buckland in all the delicious offerings at family-owned and operated Groenfell.com. That's GROENNFELL. So let's talk about, I since I've got you here, I've been doing this series on recipe development. And I want to pick everybody's brain that I talk to about recipe development, your history with it, when you became confident with it, your resources. So let me break those down into questions that you can actually answer. So when you first started brewing, were you comfortable in making your own recipes at first?
Fairly comfortable in the beginning. I at least felt safe kind of tinkering. So I think maybe from the very first recipe I did, I bought a recipe kit and then added more hops to it. So yeah, I guess from the beginning, I feel like I would read a bunch of different recipes and then kind of synthesize lots of different input into my own recipes.
So I remember when we first got together, you either made or talked about how to make an all grain starter. Making a starter work because you didn't want to use extract. You wanted to be 100% all grain in your beer. And so you made an all grain starter, I think, in a French press coffee maker. And so you have that experimental spirit from the beginning. So it doesn't surprise me that you were not intimidated by just jumping in there and figuring things out. But what were the resources that were the most influential to you for recipe development?
Al Corzona's book, just called Homebrewing Volume 1. There never actually was a Volume 2. So I read that book early on in my sort of homebrewing days, and one of the things that felt very useful in that book is it's an extract brewing focused book, which my first sort of half a dozen beers were. But even after I moved to brewing all grain, he has an extensive section in the book where he goes through and tastes different malts and has extensive sort of like tasting notes, even between like, okay, here are 5 different caramel 20s, and here are sort of tasting notes on each of those. That this one has a hint of like burnt sugar, this one has like whatever it was, kind of going through. And that felt hugely influential in terms of thinking about ingredients not just as like, oh, well, it's a chocolate malt. Same. Thinking like, okay, what are the specific notes of this one? And that then translated into just paying attention to ingredients. I feel like my early recipes, sort of first 5 years of homebrewing, were complex and layering ingredients onto my beers, where I had a porter that I brewed quite a bit, and I think there were 9 different malts in it, where I was sort of trying to like fill different places in a flavor spectrum, and like that was how I was achieving it, by just sort of layering on ingredients. And then I brewed a beer that really changed the way I thought about beer. I did a saison with the Blaujie strain. It was Maris Otter and Hersbrucker and this Blaujie strain, and that was it. That was all that was in it, and it was maybe my favorite beer that I had ever brewed. And it just completely changed my mind about thinking about where complexity and depth in beer come from, that simple recipes can have incredible depth of flavor, and that you as a brewer can kind of get out of the way a little bit and let those flavors shine through. And that has informed how I have brewed ever since.
Very nice. Yeah, the smash beers and the experiments that we've done, targeting individual ingredients, are very informative. And brewing often, we say, brew often and taste and make notes and things like that. What nowadays, when you go to design a recipe, what is the first step? I mean, do you start with? Well, I guess it depends on the style, but what are the first blocks of the foundation that you lay down in designing a recipe?
So we're very small. And in that context, we have an advantage that we actually share with home brewers that a lot of professional breweries don't. And I think this is worth pointing out. We read a lot of recipes that are like, oh, well, this huge brewery brewed this beer 80% two-row. And then there's all these things layered on top of it. That's not necessarily how they would make that recipe in a perfect world. If you are brewing at huge volume, you can kind of get that basic two-row barley for significantly less than you can get any other sort of thing in your brewery. So you have to, the economics of that make it so that you have to base your beers on that.
There are silos outside at a large brewery that are full of that.
So some of the malts that people use are actually compensating for the shortcomings of basic two-row. So biscuit malt, melanoidin, a lot of the sort of crystal malts, a lot of those things sort of exist at a commercial level to kind of fill in some of the complexity that sort of basic American two-row is lacking. So what you as a home brewer and what we as sort of a very small brewery can do is, instead of starting with something that's pretty generic, you can start your recipe with a base malt that already is going in the direction that you want. So we use a bunch of heirloom malt varieties, the Ericlea that we're using today. We use a lot of Maris Otter. There's some fantastic new ones that Chris has put out on the market. Plumage Archer is super fun. If you have not brewed with Plumage Archer, it's got all this flavor just on its own. There's the Bohemian Pilsner malt from Weyermann is heirloom Czech barley. So starting with something that already has really great character, and then making sure that anything that you add on top of that is sort of doing double duty. So with a lot of our dark beers, if we are trying to sort of really layer on additional kind of deep maltiness, we'll use dark Munich malt instead of just plain Munich malt, because then you are also beginning to add good color, more depth of flavor than just sort of like, oh, well, there's Munich, but then we're going to also have to add melanoidin or whatever the case may be. So I would say our recipes always start with base malt. Choosing something that has character from the beginning.
Yeah, there was a period of time where I would buy 50-pound bags of two-row because, it was a little bit cheaper and made me feel like a real brewer, that I had, my own mini silo of two-row, and I had my own grain mill, and, I had this library of ingredients that I could pull upon. But then I got locked into, I got all that two-row that I got to use. And so my recipes, started to be shaped by this inventory that I had at my house. And so it's the same. It's the same paradigm as the big brewery with the giant silo outside. They use it because they got it, and it's cheaper. So that's good advice. Find interesting base malts to base your beer on, and that way you don't have to layer on as much stuff on top of it.
And then you can use your local homebrewing shop. They have a better mill than you do, and they'll mill exactly what you need.
Yeah, and you're helping them to overturn their stock so that it's fresher, and so you get fresher ingredients. And if it's sitting in a paper bag in a bucket, in my basement, it's not going to be as fresh as stuff that turns over in the retail setting. So I'm assuming that you have the same approach to hops as well.
I would say, yeah, a pretty similar approach. Every one of our beers gets bittered with Northern Brewer. I really love the sort of bittering quality, particularly of German Northern Brewer. I would say our beers are more bitter on average than is currently trendy, but I deeply believe in bitterness as a flavor component that makes beer refreshing. So we both work to make our beers very well attenuated and again, a little bit more bitter than is sort of currently trending. And then a lot of old world variety hops, especially in the IPAs. We obviously play with fun new varieties too, although we are committed to not using any proprietary hop varieties. There are incredibly good hops that are university developed or traditional. And again, with the choices that we make sort of affecting agriculture, there's a company somewhere that's telling a farmer whether or not they can plant more Citra. I would rather farmers be able to choose the hop varieties they want. And so by using varieties that are public domain, developed by universities, we are hoping to give farmers more freedom and flexibility, not having to pay for licensing hop varieties. So it's a fun design constraint, and it feels like that means that if you sort of look through our menu, you see hop varieties that no one else, that are definitely on the obscure side. And it's because I'm not using any of the like super trendy hops, just because we don't use proprietary hops.
Nothing with a TM after it.
Absolutely. Or a circle R.
Yeah. Now, and off he goes again to push a button. Now you use a yeast strain that you ferment in your open fermenters, and you top crop and you pitch from batch to batch as much as possible. In using that single strain of yeast, do you see that ever as a limitation?
Yes. Sometimes I want to brew saisons. But it's helpful since saisons evidently aren't cool anymore. It keeps me from making beers that nobody seems to want to drink. Someday I think it's possible that I would add one more yeast strain when we're sort of brewing frequently enough that it makes it possible to sort of juggle a second strain. But no, generally, the honest answer is I really enjoy this one strain and how well I'm getting to know this yeast. I feel like I've been brewing with this for like 3.5 years, one strain, every day, it's the same strain. And I understand things about it that I never would have if I was swapping in between. Like when I brewed at West Mountain, I had 4 different yeast strains that I was regularly cycling through, and then there'd be a wild card in there too. I'd do a lager. So no, this is really interesting. Because of our open fermenters, and the incredible deep mat of yeast that's sort of on top of the beer, and the fact that they're very pokey old British vessels that don't have sampling ports, I have to rely on how the yeast looks and smells to know where I am in the fermentation process. And there is a very specific bright early spring sort of floral quality as the yeast sort of begins its sort of fermentation process, as it enters that sort of middle phase where things are working really hard. It is lemon grove. It's massive citrusy esters. And then as the sort of fermentation begins to tail down, I start getting sort of tropical fruit notes, little kind of caramely touches, and I know when it kind of gets to that point in the aroma process, and it also how that mat of yeast is looking on top of the beer, I have a really good sense of what's happening in the beer. I do feel like I could spend a lifetime learning this yeast strain, and it will be always interesting.
Wow. Well, I have a feeling that you're going to have to get busier here momentarily. So this has been a blast to get together and chat and watch you work and to be able to just spend the day with a friend that I'd never get to see.
It has been so nice. And we have hours to come. It's going to be great.
Yeah, we could still get into a big fight later. Some topic will come up that'll,
I feel very confident. It's going to be a good day.
Well, thanks, Casey.
Thank you. It's great to have you here. Great to see you.
Well, thanks again to Casey. Really looking forward to tasting how that beer turns out. The first runnings were just amazing. Really good. It was too early in the day for a hot scotchy, but boy, that would have been nice. And stay tuned for a video episode in the future featuring Casey and his really cool setup at Ivory Bill in Siloam Springs. In the meantime, if you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our mobile-friendly shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody supporting us through our Patreon page. Special goodies coming your way. Check that out at patreon.com/basicbrewing. That's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dotson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. In the meantime, stay well and stay tuned. So long.